Imagine waking in a house where wealth glitters from every surface, polished floors, imported rugs, carved furniture, but discovering in the silence that none of it can steady the ground beneath your feet. That was Baba Ao's dawn. The rooster had not even crowed when he sat, staring into the stillness, carrying in his chest a knot tighter than any rope used in the cattle fields. He was a man praised in every corner, the most respected figure in the village. His lands stretched past the horizon, his storage houses fed families during drought, his livestock thundered over hills. Yet none of this could soothe the storm he carried within. For while his hands still grasped abundance, his heart trembled for fear of his only son, Ikenna. The boy had been born into gold, into plenty, into the open palms of servants and the smug laughter of friends who ate without earning. But his soul, Baba Ao feared, was paper-thin. Purpose had never rooted itself in him, only appetite, only arrogance. Wealth gave him wings, but purpose gave him no ground, and a bird that cannot land eventually falls. So Baba Ao made a choice as harsh as drought and as necessary as rain. He would leave, not to vanish from love or duty, but to peel away every shield that wealth wrapped around his son, to test if the boy's bones were still capable of standing upright when naked of comfort. He packed nothing but a small bag, sealed the accounts, emptied the safe, made silence of halls that once rang endlessly with footsteps. Then, before the sun rose, he walked away upon the dusty road, staff in hand, leaving hope as his only inheritance, for now. At that exact hour, Ikenna slept a deep, luxurious sleep, curled among sheets perfumed with imported oils, his mouth bitter from the night's wine, but his body still relaxed in the cocoon of ease. He did not stir when his father's sandals brushed against gravel on the road leading away. Morning stretched itself into the house like a thief. The curtains let slivers of light crawl through high windows, slowing to rest on crystal vases, velvet furniture, gold-framed photographs. The mansion, once booming with life, now stretched hollow and vacant. Ikenna stirred only when the sun struck his face, rubbed his temple, and rolled lazily from the bed. His voice croaked with routine pride. "Cook! Driver! Coffee!" But the names fell into still air. He frowned, shook the sleep from his limbs. Surely someone had overslept. He raised his voice louder, calling again for servants, for gardeners, for anyone. Footsteps never came. No pot boiled. No polished shoes shuffled across marble. Silence clung around him like damp cloth. Irritated, he stormed through the halls and noticed something he had never noticed before. Decay. Dust lay in corners. Flowers sagged half-dead in their glass prisons. Doors he burst open revealed emptiness. Rooms stripped bare of recent care. Panic pricked his skin. He hurried to the kitchen and found cold pans, crumbs curled in corners, the absence of life itself. It was here the first cold stab of fear reached his chest. "No," he muttered, breath shallow. "No, this is a mistake." But it was no mistake. He rushed to his father's office, that dense room of secrets and decisions. There the heavy safe gaped like a tomb. Inside, nothing but a single yellowed envelope. His name carved across the face with his father's steady hand. He tore it open with trembling fingers. "Son, an inheritance without roots is only wind. Learn to walk before you inherit. I left no wealth for you now, but I left you a path. When you learn the value of a home, we will meet again." The words struck harder than fists. His vision blurred with rage. He seized his phone, clawing to reach bank accounts. Every line marked the same, blocked. His stomach sank. Within hours, the whole village already knew. Women balancing water on their heads whispered, "The boy has fallen." Men shook their heads, muttered, "Let him taste real cassava before he boasts again." Children giggled, mocking, "The prince has no crown." By afternoon, his so-called friends, men who drank his wine, lounged in his pools, clapped shoulders in loud parties, had disappeared like dew under sun. Not one knock sounded on the gate. No mat, no porridge, no sympathy. He was utterly alone. That night, hunger clawed his belly the way termites eat wood. Slow but deadly. For the first time his stomach groaned not from delayed feasts but from absence. His hands shook as he opened cabinets. Empty jars, worn spices, useless perfumes of food long gone. He tried to light a fire, tried to boil rice, ended in smoke, in burnt ruins, in eggs cracking on the ground. The acrid stench filled the halls once perfumed by cook's mastery. He slid to the kitchen floor and held his knees, the silence surrounding him like stone walls. Words buried themselves into his head with pounding rhythm. Inheritance without roots is wind. That night, voices outside mocked. Old men spoke as if to the night air, but their words were arrows. He thought money was eternal. Now he will see how long pride feeds him. The sun with no skin cannot stand under the sun. Ikenna pressed hands to ears, but each word seeped in, cruel, undeniable. As the rooster crowed the next dawn, he realized the disaster wasn't just money gone. It was facing his reflection, seeing not a man but a boy grown tall only in shadow. His father's absence forced a mirror into his shaking hands. He left the mansion half-dazed. The markets were alive with shouts, fabrics fluttering, hot oil crackling. Yet each voice seemed to mock him, each face turned colder than stone. He kept his eyes low, stumbling through judgment heavy as chains. An old woman in a blue scarf pointed at him in the square. There goes Baba Ao's son, the boy who thought gold was his roots. Murmurs chased after. Men shook their heads. The very soil itself stood against him. Desperate, he stumbled to the bank. The manager, once syrup-tongued, now stone-faced, only repeated, "The accounts are suspended. There is nothing to access." "I'm sorry, sir." The coffee machine that once steamed for him now sat cold. He staggered out, pulse thundering, each stride heavier than the last. He searched the roads, calling for his father. Climbed slopes, feet tearing on stones he had never once walked barefoot upon. He knocked on doors, shouted, "Baba Ao! My father, where is he?" But neighbors shook their heads, some pitying, some mocking. The truth was, no one carried the answer, and even fewer cared to carry his despair. Night fell swiftly, smothering him in its cloak. Hunger sliced him. Streets swarmed with the smell of fire-roasted yams and bubbling oil, but his pockets rattled with only betrayal. His throat tightened as he begged at an inn. The owner, eyes hard, declared, "No coin, no room." He knelt. Pride turned to ash on his lips. A mat, a corner. "I will pay." Her mouth flattened, pity flickered, and at last she pointed to the smallest room. A thin mat on a damp floor, a blanket that carried the odor of mold. There among the barking of stray dogs and the hollow songs of insects, Ikenna lay, staring at a ceiling that seemed closer than sky. The darkness whispered what the village had already said aloud. "You were rich in gold but poor in soul, and now your hunger is your teacher." He closed his eyes, shivering on the mat. The once prince fallen into a dust he had long despised. And in that timeless silence, what hurt most was not hunger nor shame. It was the echoing absence of the father's lap that once shielded him. Gone now not from cruelty, but from love deeper than gold. This was the beginning. The journey that would either forge him into a man, or bury him as the boy who mistook inheritance for purpose. Where are your friends, your parties, your empty laughter? Shame gnawed his soul, each piece ripped off like living skin. At dawn, hunger pushed him back into the street. With no money, he wandered among the stalls, watching food scraps fall to the ground, fought over by skinny dogs. The smell of burnt oil and roasted corn drove him mad. A tone moment, he eyed a plate of leftovers in a cart's corner, and for an instant he considered grabbing it, but pride still held his hand like an invisible chain. Little by little, Ikenna discovered that life outside the mansion walls was a shadowless jungle, where every step demanded courage, and every sip required sacrifice. He began to beg for scraps of conversation, scraps of food, scraps of dignity. In every face that ignored him, he saw a mirror of himself. The man who once turned his face away from those who knocked at his door, asking for bread. One late afternoon, almost fainting, he sat on a log beside the dry river, staring at the stagnant water between the rocks. His feet were swollen, his hands dirty, his beard starting to grow unkempt. The boy who was once a king now looked like a wanderer. In that damp solitude, I can have repeated to himself like a bitter spell, "He'll pay me for this humiliation. He'll pay." It was a phrase he clung to keep from sinking completely. But deep inside, a fragile whisper asked, "Is it really the father's fault? Or was it the world collecting the debt of your indifference?" In the village, children ran past laughing, not knowing that they man on the log was the heir to lands that once seemed infinite. Women walked by with baskets of cassava and bananas, glancing at him with distant compassion, as if they were seeing a stray dog. In the silence of dusk, the sky turned red like fresh blood, announcing another cold night. I stood up with difficulty, his legs heavy as soaked logs. He dragged himself back to the inn. On that crooked, dusty road, for the first time in many years, he felt that each step was paid with sweat, with pain, with truth. Luxury was a distant ghost, and vanity no longer fit in his hungry body. And it was there on that road that the seed of transformation began to sprout, still small, almost invisible, but alive, because sometimes you have to tear the skin of the soul to be reborn. And I, Kenna, without even realizing it, was beginning to walk, not as an heir, but as a man. Dawn arrived gray like a badly washed sheet hanging in the wind. Ia woke up to the metallic crowing of roosters and the hurried footsteps outside. His body ached as if it had been beaten all night. His bones cracked, Ash got up, his skin stuck to the rough fabric of his clothes. Looking around, he saw nothing but peeling walls, a cracked bucket, and a sliver of soap. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the patchy beard, the cold sweat. He took a deep breath. In that breath, there was still a thin thread of vanity, but each day pulled more of it away. The innkeeper kicked him out early, saying she needed the room for someone who could pay. Ia, clutching the small bundle that now held his only belongings, stumbled into the street, eyes on the dusty ground. He had no destination, only a hidden desire to find his father and break the punishment that burned in his chest like a live ember. He wandered aimlessly, stumbling over stones, dodging stalls, hearing children's laughter and the shouts of vendors, the smell of fried cassava, flour, fish baking in the sun, and rotting fruit mixed together, a memory of a life he had never known how to live. Turning into a narrow alley, Aya saw a large iron gate creaking in the wind. Above it, a faded sign read, "Manufacturing and Repairs Factory." It wasn't a place that drew attention. It was one of those corners of the world where men and women carry the weight of daily bread, where dignity is measured in calloused hands and sweat-soaked faces. Inside, the sound of hammers, welding sparks, heavy boxes dragged across the floor. A chorus of deep voices, sharp orders, noises that pounded like war drums on the chest of anyone unfamiliar with hard labor. Akenna stopped at the door, heart pounding. A foreman looked him up and down, eyes hard as stone. "What do you want here?" "Lost pretty boy." Akenna stammered. His voice choked. "I am looking for work. Anything?" The foreman laughed. A short, dry laugh. "Work. We don't play pretend here. Here we sweat, bleed, eat when we can. You're up for that." Aiken lowered his eyes and only nodded. Then from the back of the yard, an old thin man appeared. His back bent, hair already gray. He wore a jumpsuit stained with grease and dust, a shovel in his hands. His steps were slow but firm, each footprint sinking into the mud as a testament to endurance. His small, deep eyes held an ocean of stories. It was Baba Iyo, but there he wasn't the landowner, the millionaire, the feared man of the village. He was just another worker, another body among iron and dust. Ikenna didn't recognize him at first. He only saw an old, frail man with a gaze that pierced beyond skin and lies dot when their eyes met. Baba Iyo gripped the shovel tighter. Inside, his heart shook like bamboo in the wind. His son stood there, thin, hollow-eyed, the once proud face now covered in dust and shame. He wanted to run to him, embrace him, wipe every tear with his hands, say, "My son, come home." But he held back. Because sometimes love is holding the embrace, letting pain teach where words can't reach. Ika felt a shiver down his spine. There was something strange about that old man. A warmth in his eyes, a silence that screamed, but his confused mind couldn't understand it. He followed the foreman's orders, receiving a broom and a leaky bucket. The work was to sweep the yard, push dust that returned with every gust of wind, carry garbage to the corner, push dirty water into the drains. Every pull of the broom scratched his soul. The air once used to commanding now bent his back, his skin burning under the sun. The blisters on his hands burst, stinging like hot coals. The smell of grease filled his nostrils and clung to his hair. His thirst burned, but water was rationed, given in cracked plastic cups only after the foreman's signal. The old Baba Ao watched from afar. Each fall of his son felt like a knife to his chest when Akenna stumbled over buckets or knelt exhausted. Baba Iyo turned away, holding back tears with gritted teeth, looking up at the sky and murmuring, "Lord, give me strength not to run to him now. Give me courage to let him be born." At the end of the first day, Ina collapsed onto the ground, his hands shaking. Sweat dripped, mixing with tears. The foreman let out a laugh, giving up. "Pretty boy, tomorrow there's more." Aya didn't answer. He stared at the floor as if looking into an abyss. That night, he slept in a corner of the warehouse on empty cement sacks. His body complained in every muscle. The wounds burned like fire. The factory sounds, even silenced, still echoed in his mind. He dreamed of the old soft bed, long baths, silver cutlery, but he woke with a dry throat and a face crusted with dust. When he opened his eyes, he saw the old worker passing by with a wheelbarrow full of rubble. For a moment, their eyes met again, and there, deep in those tired eyes, something stirred inside Icona. A flash of familiarity, a tightening in the chest, a longing he didn't even know he had. But he quickly looked away, ashamed. He didn't know that old man carried insolence every tear, every prayer whispered in lonely dawns. every coin that once supported his whims. The next day started the same, but something in the air felt different. Ikenna got up earlier, picked up the broom without being called, began cleaning before orders came. The foreman watched, puzzled. The old man from afar almost let a smile slip, but quickly swallowed it. It wasn't time to soften his heart. Each day in the factory was a silent sermon. The dirty floor was the pulpit. The sweat was the prayer. The calluses were the psalms. Ikenna, even without understanding, began to hear these wordless prayers, and the old man each night knelt in a dark corner of his makeshift room, eyes brimming with tears, whispering, "Let him understand, Lord. Let him see the root before he wants the fruit." And so passed the silent reunion, full of pain and invisible seeds, a father and son, separated by walls of pride and shame, but united by an invisible thread called love. A love that doesn't shout, doesn't pound its chest, but stays there, firm as a rock, waiting for the right day to bloom. In those iron and mud corridors, destiny began to weave a new fabric. A fabric not made of luxury, but of dignity, of truth, of earth. And each hammer blow, each shout from the foreman, each dragging step of the old man was a stitch in this silent weave, which one day would become the cloak of redemption. The days at the factory repeated like an old chant, heavy with pain and dust, the sound of hammers mixed with the groaning of iron being shaped, while IA, head down, pushed brooms, carried buckets, mended sacks. His body was no longer the same. Hands, once soft as silk, were now rough, marked with cuts and calluses that burned at the slightest touch. His face, once smooth and perfumed, now bore deep lines, dust, and a hardened expression, as if he had aged years in just a few months. The men around him watched with a mix of distrust and curiosity. They knew he was an outsider, someone not born for that ground, but who day by day was sinking into it. And amid all that grayness, a spark of color appeared like a stubborn flower sprouting from a crack in stone. It was a hot morning, the sun burning early, making the air dance in waves over the yard. Anna dragged himself along, pushing a wheelbarrow of rubble that seemed twice his weight. Sweat ran in rivers down his neck, sticking his shirt to his chest. Then he heard a soft yet firm voice echo beside him. "If you push like that, you'll hurt your back. Let me show you." He turned, surprised, and saw a young woman with deep eyes, thin but strong arms, and a contained smile that seemed to hold the world's secrets. She wore a cloth tied around her head to protect her hair from the dust, and she carried a bucket of clothes on her head with almost poetic grace. She introduced herself as Njosi, a washerwoman from a nearby village. She lived with her grandmother, a blind woman full of proverbs, and dreamed of having a small space to sew, where she could teach other girls to embroider and sell at the market. She was not a woman of empty words, but of gestures that spoke loudly. Njosi looked at EA as if reading an open book. She saw beyond the torn clothes and sweat into the wounded man hiding behind those lowered eyes. Without asking permission, she took the wheelbarrow from his hands, adjusted the position, and showed him how to distribute the weight to avoid straining his arms and back. Ikenna, embarrassed, tried to protest. I know how to do it," but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. Enjoy just laughed, a short, vibrant laugh full of life. "You don't know anything, but you'll learn. Every man learns when he has to carry not just the wheelbarrow, but life." That encounter, seemingly simple, was the first breath of fresh air in Ikenna's suffocated chest. For the first time, someone corrected him without fear, without flattery, without interest. Those firm hands held more than the wheelbarrow, they held unknowingly his destiny. In the following days, Enjoy returned to the factory, delivering washed clothes to workers or fetching water from the courtyard well. Each time she passed, she left a trail of curious silence. The men stopped to look, not for her beauty, though she was beautiful in her simplicity, but for the silent strength she carried. One afternoon, I saw her balancing 2 basins of clothes on her head. Walking with firm steps and a straight back, he ran to help, grabbing one of the basins. She looked at him in surprise but didn't protest. For the first time, Ikenna felt that a small gesture could be worth more than any jewel. As they walked together, Angoy spoke of her grandmother, a woman who, even blind, made lace and taught the village girls to embroider their own stories. She told how she had learned from childhood to wash for others, to share the little she had, to smile even with a growling stomach. She spoke with a sparkle in her eyes that contrasted with the harshness of the ground. When they reached the riverbank, Ngoy began scrubbing clothes vigorously, beating soap against the stones. Ikenna stood still watching. He had never seen anyone wash clothes. It looked like a ritual, a dance between hands, foam, and current. The sun reflected on the water, lighting up her focused face. "Why do you do this alone? Isn't it too heavy?" he asked, almost voiceless. And Josie paused, lifted her eyes to him. Heavy is living without purpose. Clothes you wash, dry wear again. But a dirty heart, no soap can cleanse that. Understand? Akenna felt a chill. Her words cut into him like a blade. He wanted to speak but swallowed air, feeling a hot wave rise to his face. Inozi gave a slight smile as if she already knew that reaction. On the way back, she asked if he had a steady job yet. He replied that he still swept the yard and carried trash when told. Enjoy thought for a moment, then said, Next week they'll need help in the loading shed. If you want, I can recommend you, but be warned. There. The work is rough. A man who can't handle it goes home limping. He nodded. For the first time, he didn't feel ashamed of being seen as weak. Something inside him begged to be rebuilt from the ground up. And in Josie seemed to be the quiet cement of this new foundation. Days passed and seeing Inozi became routine. Sometimes she brought him a piece of cooked cassava. Other times just a short word, but loaded with strength. Head up, she'd say when he passed by, dragging his steps. Or the mud that dirties you today can be the clay that shapes you tomorrow. In the village, the murmurs started. Who's this washerwoman walking with Baba Ao's son? They asked. Did she bewitch the boy? Others whispered. But Enjoy didn't care. She carried on caring for her grandmother, washing clothes, planting invisible seeds in tired hearts. For Rakenna, each encounter with her was a silent lesson. Pride wilted like a leaf in the sun. His chest, once swollen with titles and inheritance, now open to a new kind of wealth. The value of a gesture, the power of a true word. And in that slow rhythm, between factory dust and river foam, Akenna began to see life with different eyes. Eyes that didn't seek applause, but meaning. Eyes that learned day by day the difference between owning everything and owning oneself. Inozi, without realizing it, became not just the woman, who would change everything but the mirror. Where he finally began to see himself not as an heir, not as Baba Io's son, but as a man, and there a man wasn't the one who had the most. He was the one who endured, who shared, who stayed even when the ground trembled. Life in that forgotten corner of the world began to teach Akenna that the greatest fortunes are born from calloused hands and hearts cleansed of lies, and as he pushed wheelbarrows and picked up trash, the seed of a new destiny began to sprout. A destiny woven by a washerwoman stitched in the mud, watered with silent tears. The sun rose lazily, spreading a weak light over the zinc roofs and the damp mud of the alleys. The Ruers' crow mixed with the clatter of buckets at the well and the shuffle of sandals on the sidewalks. It was another day beginning, the same for everyone. But inside Akenna, a silent new dawn was already stirring. He woke before the rooster crowed, his muscles throbbing, his hands heavy as if carrying stones. He left the inn with sleep still marked on his face, his stomach empty, but something different vibrated in his chest. When he arrived at the factory, he found Enjoy waiting with a short smile and a look that seemed to already know all the world's pains. She handed him a small bowl of thin porridge made from corn and water. It wasn't a feast, but for Akenna, it felt like a gift from the heavens. Don't work on an empty stomach, she said, almost like an old proverb. He held the bowl carefully as if it were rare porcelain, and slowly swallowed each spoonful, feeling the warmth slide down his throat and heat his chest. The taste was simple, almost without salt, but it was the first meal that felt like it had a soul. After the porridge, Ngoy accompanied him to the loading shed. There the work was harder than anything he had ever faced. Heavy sacks of grain, iron crates, thick ropes that burned the skin with the slightest slip. Sweat poured like rain, soaking his shirt, sticking dust to his body. His arms trembled, his chest heaved, and each step felt like a march across an endless desert. During one of these shifts, as he tried to lift a sack of rice bigger than himself, I have felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. His legs buckled. His body crashed down. His face hit the hard earth. Pain exploded in his palm, opened into a deep cut. Hot red blood began to run between his fingers, and Goy ran to him, dropping her laundry basin to the ground. She held his hand firmly, examined the wound, and without saying a word, tore a piece of the cloth that covered her hair. Carefully, she washed his hand in a bucket of dirty water, blowing gently to soothe the sting. While she cleaned, her eyes never left. A man who doesn't know how to care for a wound will never know how to care for a home. The phrase entered him like a spear, breaking the last bits of pride that still resisted inside. I looked down, felt the salt of his tears mix with the blood sliding down his cheek. He didn't know how to explain the crying. It wasn't just from the pain in his hand, nor from the shame of falling in front of others. It was an old crying hidden in silences, muffled during parties, drowned by false laughter. Ngoy tied the cloth carefully, tight enough to stop the bleeding, but not to hurt more. Then she passed her thumb across his cheek, wiping away a tear. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt bigger than any fortune. That day, I returned home with his hand bandaged, his body wrecked, but his mind brighter than ever. The silence of the walk weighed heavy, and he repeated Onjua's phrase to himself like a sacred chant. The next day, even with his hand throbbing, he returned to work. There was no room for excuses, no soft bed to hide in. The foreman, seeing him arrive, let out a mocking laugh, but said nothing. The other workers just shook their heads, some with silent respect, others still with disdain. With every sack lifted, every dragged step, Akana felt not only the weight of the load, but the weight of old choices. He remembered the nights when he dismissed advice, laughed at his father's worries, saw humble women as voiceless shadows. Between one load and another, Akana began to observe more. He watched Njozi wash clothes, fold cloths carefully, smile at each customer who arrived with dirty bags. He watched the old men fixing tools, the mothers selling fritters by the roadside, the barefoot boys running round dirty but with a light in their eyes. Humility, which once felt like a distant word to him, began to become a living matter seeping into his paws. He felt for the first time that he wasn't greater than anyone, that the world didn't revolve around his name, nor the money tied to his last name. One afternoon, while collecting buckets in the yard, Ikena saw a small boy wearing torn shorts and with injured feet standing by the gate. The boy stared fixedly at a piece of bread forgotten on a wooden bench. Without thinking, IA picked up the bread, approached, and held it out. The boy grabbed it with shining eyes, smiled, and ran away. Turning back, I saw Inozi standing at the shed entrance, arms crossed, watching in silence. Her gaze was a mix of surprise and tenderness, like someone seeing a flower sprouting from stone. She didn't say anything, but the faint smile she gave was enough to light up his chest. That night, lying on the hard floor of his room, Ikena ran his fingers over the makeshift bandage on his hand. The cut stung. But what hurt most was the memory of his vanity, the words he once used to hurt his father, the empty laughs with friends who had vanished. He closed his eyes and in the dark saw his father's face, a tired face but full of hope, the same face he had ignored so many times. He whispered almost like a prayer. I didn't know. I didn't know how blind I was. The pain in the wound was now a loyal companion, a reminder that each drop of spilled blood was a piece of the old Iken dying. The first seeds of humility planted by firm hands and true words began to sprout. And if before he ran from the ground, now it was the ground that held his uncertain steps, guiding him onto a path he had never imagined walking. The man who once saw himself as a tongue was king was now learning to serve himself. And each fallen tear, each formed callus, each silent gesture of kindness was a brick in the reconstruction of his soul. A soul that finally began to become a home. Dawn arrived slowly, as if it too wanted to witness the slow awakening of the man who once thought himself untouchable. I awoke with his body still heavy, but something in his heart already pulsed differently. His bandaged hand throbbed with each movement, reminding him that every step now cost sweat, pain, and humility. He left early before the foreman's first shouts echoed across the yard. He walked in silence to the well, washed his face with cold water that bited his skin as if trying to strip away the last layers of pride. Still clinging to him, lifting his face, he saw Enjoy approaching with a basket on her head. The basket looked heavy, but she walked firmly, balancing herself like someone carrying not just clothes, but dreams. Good morning, he murmured, almost embarrassed, as if the words were new in his mouth. Enjoy stopped, looked at him, and gave a slight smile. Good morning, man with calloused hands, she replied, setting the basket on the ground. Ikena offered to help, but she refused with a gentle gesture. The basket isn't as heavy as the choices we carry, she said. Holding his gaze for a few seconds, he lowered his head, feeling the weight of that phrase hammering in his chest. Throughout the day, Ina worked in the loading shed. The sacks felt heavier than ever. The ropes burned his hands even through the bandages. Still, he persisted. There was no more space for excuses or complaints. Each drop of sweat was a brick in the construction of a new man. When the sun was high, hunger began to claw at his stomach. It was a dry hunger, scratching his ribs from the inside. He remembered the lavish banquets as he had left her feet, the fine dishes, the desserts he never even tasted. Going out for some air, he walked to the back of the factory. That was when he saw a scene that shattered the last wall of vanity inside. Him and was sitting under a tree with a piece of hardened bread in her hands. Next to her was a skinny dog, its ribs showing, eyes pleading. Without hesitation, Ingoy tore the bread in half. She gave the bigger piece to the dog and kept the smaller one for herself. The animal ate quickly as if afraid it was only a mirage. Shimian chewed slowly, watching the dog with tenderness. Iana stood frozen as if time had stopped. His throat tightened, his eyes burned. He approached but found no words. His silence said everything, and she understood. Ngoy turned her face to him, smiled softly, and said, "Those who share the little They have multiply what they are inside. He sat down beside her, feeling the rough ground, the dust rising around his ankles. They stayed there, sharing the silence. He looked at the bread in her hand as if it were a rare jewel. It wasn't about the bread itself, but the gesture, the act of sharing, even when you have almost nothing. Ikena's mind drifted. He remembered the table at home covered with delicacies, imported fruits, expensive wines. He remembered pushing away untouched plates, despising the work of those who prepared each dish. He remembered empty laughs as he threw pieces of meat on the floor, mocking the servants who tried to please him. There, in that moment, a bitter taste rose in his mouth different from any spoiled food. It was the taste of shame, of a conscience, finally opening its eyes. The bread in Angio's hand looked like an altar, and the hungry dog, a silent angel teaching him about value, about roots, about truth. Nyozi broke the silence again. You know, we don't just die from stomach hunger. We also die from soul hunger. Many out there have full plates, but dry hearts. Ikena couldn't hold back his tears. His hands trembled, his chest heaved. He bowed his head. The tears fell to the ground, forming small muddy puddles in the dust. Enjoy said nothing, just reached out and held his hand. A simple gesture, but it carried the weight of 1,000 sermons. After that day, Ika began to eat every piece of fufu, every spoon of beans, as if it were the last. No crumb was ever wasted again. When he received a handful of flour, he silently gave thanks, remembering the dog, the bread, the falling tears. Little by little, the workers began to notice. The young man who once worked grudgingly now offered help, shared the little he had, smiled. Even with dirty clothes and an aching back, a man who learns the value of food also learns the value of life. At night, lying on his mat, Ikena remembered each bite, each smell, each texture. Every meal became a sacred ritual, an invitation to gratitude. And in the silence of the room, between the scurry of rats and the dripping roof, he murmured short prayers heavy with pain and hope. From afar, old Baba Yo watched everything. Every step of his son was a knife and a bomb. The father saw his son die slowly to be reborn in silence. In the solitude of his shack, Baba Ao knelt on the cold floor, thanking God for the harshness of the path. Lord, let him understand that abundance begins in the heart. Let him learn that sharing does not impoverish but enriches the soul. And so, in the quiet sharing of a piece of hardened bread, in the gaze of a forgotten dog, in the firm hand of a washerwoman, Ikena rediscovered not just the value of food, but the taste of life. A life finally chewed with gratitude, swallowed with respect, digested with humility. There under that tree on the dusty ground, a new man was born. A man who, before satisfying his stomach, learned to feed his soul. And this perhaps was the most urgent hunger he had never known how to name. Night fell slowly, spreading a dark cloak over the village. Lanterns flickered in the corners of mud houses, casting long shadows on the walls. The wind blew cold, carrying the smell of burning wood, roasted corn, and a quiet longing. Old Baba Ao, sitting hidden behind the shed, watched with heavy eyes. The day had been long, dragging on like a sorrowful chant. Every step of his son was a deep cut in the father's heart. The man who was once seen as untouchable was now just a thin figure covered in dust and patches. Baba Ale, disguised in his stained jumpsuit, pretended not to see, but each gesture of Ikena burned in his soul. That night the air felt denser. The moon, thin as a blade, hid behind thick clouds. Inside the shed, Ia was finishing stacking the last sacks of corn. The foreman had already left, and the other workers had disappeared into the alleys. Inozi, beside him, was carefully folding wet cloths, preparing to take them back to her grandmother. Ikena seemed strange. His body still ached, but his face carried another kind of pain, one not seen in bone or muscle. He looked at the ground, scratched his head, inhaled as if searching for courage in the wind, and noticed. She stopped folding and turned to him, resting the basin on the floor. "Speak up!" "This silence is heavier than Theris' sacks," she said in a soft yet firm tone. Ia took a deep breath. His hand trembled. His voice broke like a forgotten chant. I wanted to say sorry." He stopped, swallowed hard, felt a bitter taste rise to his mouth. "That day when I yelled at you, ... When I pushed you, I was blind." The silence between them was so thick it was possible to hear a distant cricket chirping. And Goi looked at him steadily, her eyes shining under the faint light. "I didn't know words hurt more than stones. I didn't know that hurting someone meant carrying a weight that no river water can wash away." The words came out like thorns being pulled from his flesh. Hidden, Baba Ao leaned against the rough wall, his chest heaving, his hand trembled. gripping the handle of the hoe he used to keep his disguise. Tears welled up in his eyes, but he forced himself to stay silent and kept watching. After a long moment, she knelt, took a clean cloth, approached, and wiped his face, clearing the sweat and dust. Apologies aren't just said with the mouth, they're said with the body, with silence, with change. You're trying, and that's worth more than 1,000 empty apologies, she whispered, almost like a prayer. Ika let his face sink into her hand, tears mixing with the soap still left on the cloth. It was the first time he allowed himself to cry in front of someone since he had collapsed at the gate of the old mansion. It was an ugly, heavy cry, full of trapped sobs, but it was a clean cry, washing away the last shells of vanity. Baba Eel hidden bit his lip to keep from letting out a loud lament. The old man felt his heart beat like a drum. He finally saw his son bend, not to money, but to truth. He saw his son undress, not from clothes, but from pride. There in the dark shed, there were no applause, no choir to celebrate. But for Baba Ao, it was the grandest moment he had ever witnessed. Not his son buying a new car, not signing contracts, not laughing at parties. It was his son finally becoming a man. When Ngozi finished wiping his face, she took his wounded hands and looked at every callus, every crack, as if reading an old book. These hands will still build many things, but only if the heart helps to carry them, she said. Ye just nodded, too weak to speak. He knelt right there, holding her hands as if holding an amulet against the desert. Seeing that scene, Baba Ao bowed his head, leaned on the hoe. He cried softly like someone praying. He whispered to the ground, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for not letting me give up on him. Thank you for this son who now begins to bloom in pain." The night went on, cold and silent. Ngozi pulled Ikana up. "Come on. Tomorrow the sun rises early and work doesn't wait for anyone." He stood up slowly, still holding her hand as if, afraid that by letting go, he might lose himself again. They left the shed, walking side by side. The lanterns lit in the distant houses, flickered like nearby stars. The cold ground, the sharp breeze, everything seemed to sing a new song, a song of new beginnings, of repentance, of hope. Behind them, Baba Ao stood still. The old man looked at the dark sky, breathed deeply. His chest hurt, but it was a good pain, a healing pain. He knew the road would still be long, full of stones, falls, cold nights. But he also knew that for the first time, his son had taken the first step. In that moment, without I knowing, the father began to believe in tomorrow again. He believed once more that a man is not made by the gold that shines, but by the clay that shapes him. And in silence, the old man returned to his corner, his soul light, as if finally carrying a seed ready to sprout. Dawn arrived with a softer, almost lazy Ruers's crow, as if the whole world was breathing more calmly. That day I awoke before the sun broke the sky. His body protested. His muscles felt like overstretched ropes, but there was a burning inside him now. Not a flame of pride, but of will. He left the inn-room with firm steps, no longer dragging his feet as before. The smell of wet mud from the night before rose, bringing back childhood memories, moments when he ran barefoot before gold blinded his eyes. In that silent hallway, Ikena ran his fingers over the bandage on his wounded hand, remembering in touch the words that still echoed like a soft thunder in his mind. When he arrived at the factory yard, he found Enjoy already up, holding a bundle of colorful fabrics. Almost bigger than she was, her eyes shone with an old purpose. The kind inherited from grandmothers, mothers, and the women who hold up the world with one hand and feed it with the other. "Today we're not going to the shed," she said, adjusting the cloth on her head. Iken stopped confused. "We're not," she smiled, holding back a mischievous laugh. "Today you're coming with me to the fair. I need someone to carry these pieces, and they say you've got strong arms now." He opened his mouth to protest. But before he could, Engi was already walking quick steps, leaving a trail of dust and soap scent. With no choice, he ran after her, holding one of the bundles she had pushed against his chest. The walk to the fair was long, winding through dirt trails, crossing crooked wooden bridges, passing under big mango trees where children played and old women rested on mats. At each step, Ikena felt the villagers' eyes on him. Some recognized the rich man's son. Others just saw a sweaty man carrying bundles on his head. When they arrived at the fair's entrance, the noise was a sea of voices. Vendors shouting, prices, women haggling, chickens clucking, small drums beating in the distance. The air was a mosaic of fresh fish, roasted corn, spicy spices, and sweet fruits. Ikena's stomach growled, but something bigger than hunger filled his chest. Engi set up Asmal's space under an old mango tree. She spread a stained sheet on the ground, laid out her pieces of fabric, simple embroideries, headscarves, and small handmade dresses. There was no luxury, no shine, but there was soul in every stitch, in every line sewn patiently by lamplight. "Hold this," she ordered, handing him an improvised clothesline made of thick ropes. He obeyed. Slowly, the pieces filled the space, creating a colorful garden in that corner of the fair. Women passing by stopped, touched the fabrics, nodded in approval without noticing. IA began observing people, listening to the hidden stories in each face. An old lady bought a scarf to cover her head on Sunday. A mother bought a small dress for the baby in her arms. A man bought a piece of fabric as a gift for his sick wife at home. He held change, helped fold pieces, and smiled without forcing it. For the first time, he felt pride not in selling something expensive, but in seeing the light in people's eyes when they received something simple made with love. A young man approached, looking at Akana with curiosity. "Do you work with her?" he asked, surprised. I paused, then smiled, filling his chest as he replied, "Yes, I carry the pieces. Hold the line. Help however I can." The young man laughed sincerely and shook his hand. Good to see a man helping a woman without shame. That's rare. The phrase echoed in Ienana's mind. He who once despised any task he considered beneath him was now holding clotheslines, counting coins, smiling at each customer. And in each small gesture, he felt more like a man than in all the years he'd paraded at parties holding shiny glasses. As the day went on, the fair got crowded. The music grew louder. Drums beat stronger. Children ran with colorful lollipops. The heat was suffocating, but Josie didn't stop. She offered her pieces patiently, told the story of each embroidery, explained the meaning behind each design. I listened, learned, and silently marveled at her strength. On a moment of rest, they sat under the mango tree and shared a piece of roasted cassava bought with the day's earnings. He looked at her hands, marked by soap and needles, and realized he had never met a woman so rich. Not in coins, boot and soul. "Do you like doing this?" he asked, biting the cassava. Ngoy looked at the people around, at the clothesline swaying in the wind, at the coins spread on the cloth. "I like seeing fabric turn into stories. Seeing someone leave here with a piece of me work gives dignity, but creating connects." Ia fell silent. He chewed slowly, watching the fair's movement. The noise, the heat, the smells, everything seemed to pulse with his heart. He had never felt so alive, so present. At the end of the day, while they were packing up, Enjoy looked at him and said, "Today you didn't work for money, but for value. The value of helping, of being, of sharing." He felt tears rise, but held them back. He just gripped the clothesline tighter, looking at the ground, trying to store that moment quietly, inside his chest. They returned to the village at dusk, carrying the leftover pieces and some coins wrapped in a cloth. The path seemed shorter, the breeze cooler. That night, lying on the thin mat, I repeated to himself, "Today I sold fabrics, but I bought pieces of truth." And he fell asleep with a heart as light as the cloth swaying on Thelene, knowing deep down that the greatest profit was discovering himself a man, not by what he owned, but by what he gave. Night arrived heavy, starless, like a thick blanket over the village. The smell of burning firewood drifted through the air, mixed with the distant sound of drums announcing parties somewhere far away. But in Ikena's heart, there was no party. There was a deep silence, a desert where he walked alone, each step burying old memories deeper. After the fair, every joint in his body ached, but it was a different kind of pain, a pain that didn't ask for medicine, but for reflection. His face burned from the sun, his hands bore marks from the ropes, the scent of soap and dust mixed with sweat. All this formed a new skin over him, a skin that didn't shine but breathed truth. He walked toward the shed where he knew he would find the old worker who always swept the yard. The old man who went unnoticed by everyone else carried a mystery for Ai. There was something in his silent gaze, something in the way he held the broom, in the way he watched each detail with the care of someone tending a fragile garden. Baba Ao, hidden behind his disguise, was there pushing the broom slowly as if sweeping not just the ground, but thoughts, pains, ghosts. He heard Ia's footsteps approaching, but didn't turn. He felt the air change, the weight of his son's thoughts floating around like smoke. Ai stood there, watching the old man in silence. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if he carried a storm inside. He wanted to speak, but his tongue weighed like stone. Finally, he let out a long sigh, as if releasing a confession into the wind. "My father, he taught me to own, but he never taught me to be a man." The words fell on the shed floor like shards of glass. The old man stopped sweeping but didn't turn. He only gripped the broom handle so hard that his knuckles turned white, his heart pounded. Each beat a drum of celebration and mourning at once. Ikena continued, his eyes shining in the dim light. "He gave me everything. A big house, servants, a name that made everyone bow their heads. But he never gave me ground, never showed me the weight of a plate of food. nor the value of a tear shed in silence. The old man closed his eyes, feeling his chest tear open. Inside he wanted to scream, to run to his son, hold him in his arms and say, "Forgive me, my son." But he knew that moment wasn't his. It belonged to the son. Silence was the last teacher left. I thought being a man meant giving orders, never apologizing, never bowing your head. But today I see being a man is sharing bread even when it's small. It's holding someone's hand when the whole world turns away. Being a man is carrying shame in your chest and still moving forward. Tears streamed down Ikena's face, thick mixing with sweat. He breathed deeply as if trying to swallow the entire world to spit out all the pride that choked him. I blamed my father for everything. I thought he was the enemy. I thought it was his duty to guarantee my happiness to keep my smile alive. But the truth is, I didn't know how to smile without an audience. I didn't know how to live without applause. The old Baba Owl held each word like someone holding a clay jar full of water, afraid it might break and spill everything. He felt his own face wet but didn't move. His whole body trembled, but he stood still like Apilar holding up a collapsing roof. I was blind and deep down, deep down. I always hoped he would show up to save me, but today I understood. No one saves someone who doesn't want to be saved. Hena dropped to his knees, the dry thud echoing through the empty shed. His hands touched the dusty floor, his face pressed against the cold cement. There, in that position, he looked like a child, finally giving up the tantrum and asking to be held. The old man turned slowly, his legs feeling like soft clay. He looked at his son on the ground, head bowed, soul stripped bare. He wanted to run to him, but his body didn't obey. He just stood there breathing heavily, his heart beating in every vein. I wish I had been man enough to say thank you before, to see you not as my enemy, but as the only one who truly loved me. Today I know ... I don't need to own anything. I just need to be worthy of someone, and that someone I found in a woman who showed me that love is not a showcase. It's a root. The old man dropped the broom, which hit the ground with a hollow sound. He took a step forward, then another, each step more difficult than the last. He reached close to his son, extended his hand, but pulled it back at the last moment. It wasn't time yet. I stayed, kneeling there, chest heaving, face pressed to the floor as if trying to absorb every speck of dust, to forever remember where he came from. Baba Iyo took a step back, clutching his own hands. He wanted to say he was proud that each tear of his son was a diamond worth more than all the lands, all the gold in the world. But he swallowed the words. He knew that silence in that moment was the greatest embrace he could give. The son stayed there for minutes that felt like hours. When he finally stood up, he looked at the old man, his eyes red but steady. No words were spoken. The gaze said it all. That night, as he walked back to his room, I repeated every phrase he had spilled onto the shed floor. He felt light, as if he had removed a rusty armor that had weighed on him for years. For the first time, he felt proud not of his surname, but of the silence that remained after the tears. The old Baba Iyo returned to his corner. He sat down, held his face in his hands, and wept softly. An old cry stored since the day he buried his wife and promised her he would protect their son. In that cry there was pain, but also gratitude. In that cold, empty shed, 2 men were reborn. A father who learned that true love is also letting a son fall, and a son who discovered that the greatest victory is not conquering the world but conquering oneself. The sun rose red like embers, announcing a different kind of day. The Ruer's crow seemed longer, like a trumpet announcing change. I awoke before any movement stirred in the village. There was no sound of footsteps, no creaking of wooden gates. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a gesture from him. Sitting on his thin mat, Aya held a small ring in his hands. Simple, molded by a local blacksmith from leftover metal. It had no precious stones, no shiny gold, just a modest circle, but one loaded with meaning. He had helped polish it himself, asking the blacksmith for guidance, learning each hammer strike, each curve that fire forced the metal to accept. Looking at that ring, he saw not just a piece of jewelry, but an entire story. Every sack carried, every swallowed tear, every piece of bread shared. The walk to Ennio's house felt longer that day. Each step was a drumbeat inside his chest, his mind filled with memories like waves breaking on the shore. He remembered the empty parties, the fake laughs, the scent of imported perfume that couldn't hide the emptiness. Now there was only the smell of soap, the sound of birds, and the quiet weight of that ring hidden in his palm. Arriving at Ino's house, he saw her grandmother sitting on the doorstep. Her eyes faded by age, but alive in spirit. She smiled when she felt his presence, as if seeing with her heart what her eyes could no longer grasp. "You came," she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Ina knelt before her, held her fragile hands, and there, in a dense silence, asked for her blessing before asking for Inoz's hand. The grandmother ran her wrinkled hand over his head, whispering ancient words, words from before. Big houses, before titles, before pride. Anosi appeared at the door, holding a wet cloth. When she saw Isina kneeling, she stopped. Time seemed to stretch like a river refusing to flow. He stood up slowly, breathing deeply. The ring shone chilly in his hand. I didn't bring gold. I didn't bring diamonds. I only brought what I managed to gather from myself. He began, his voice firm but choked, and didn't move. Her large, deep eyes followed every word as if reading a prayer. I want you to be my foundation, not my display. I want you to be the ground where I learned to stand, not an ornament for others to applaud. His hands trembled but did not drop theiring. The village was so quiet you could hear the rustling of leaves on distant mango trees. Slowly, neighbors began to appear, drawn by an invisible force. Curious children, women holding basins, men laying down their hoes. Ian knelt on the dirt ground, dirtying his knees without hesitation. He raised his hand with the ring, his eyes locked on hers. I have no riches, but I have will. I have last name to promise you palaces, but I have courage to promise you effort. If you agree to walk with me, I promise to honor you, not with parties, but with simple days, not with expensive toasts, but with silences full of peace. And breath seemed trapped in her chest. Her eyes filled with tears, and a single tear ran down, cutting through the dust on her face. She stepped forward, knelt, and held his face with both hands. A man who kneels in the mud to ask for a woman rises higher than any king. She whispered words only for him. And Josie took the ring carefully, looked at it as if it were a fallen star. Then she put it on her finger, looking at the gathered village. She didn't need to say yes out loud. The gesture spoke louder than any word. The women began to cry, some hiding their faces in their aprons. The men nodded, murmuring that they had never seen such an act of humility and courage. The children clapped, not fully understanding, but sensing a joy as pure as a baby's first laugh. Ekena stood with her help. They embraced right there in the mud. Without shame, without fear, he buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of soap and river water, a perfume worth more than all the bottles he once collected. Baba Ao, hidden behind a tree, watched with wet eyes. The old man clutched his chest, feeling his heartbeat as if it might leap from his mouth. He knew that this was the end of a long journey full of falls and stones. In that embrace, the old man didn't just see a son. He saw Aman, a man reborn in mud, purified in silence, who found value not in inheritance, but in sharing a life. When they stepped back, they saw the grandmother smiling. Her hands joined Asif holding a prayer, ready to fly. In the background, an old drum started to beat softly like a heart celebrating. Slowly, the village began to sing, improvising verses about love, mud, and courage. There was no banquet hall, no champagne, no flowery speeches. There was only truth, earth, sweat, and a ring made from the humblest metal, but with the most eternal shine. That day, the entire village witnessed not just a marriage proposal, but the birth of a new man, a story to be told for generations. On warm nights around the fire, Ia looked at Anosi, squeezed her hand tightly, and in that look, without needing any words, he promised, I will no longer hide behind surnames or high walls. I will live by your side in the mud, in the rain, in the sun, in life, and the village in respectful silence. Understood? Understood that there is no greater wealth than loving without fear of kneeling. That whoever learns to bow before love stands taller than the whole world. The sun set slowly, dyeing the sky a deep red, as if it wanted to store in every cloud the memory of a day no one in the village would ever forget. The earth still bore the marks of feet that gathered to witness the birth of a new love. The voices, once loud with song, turned into gentle murmurs, almost like prayers. At the edge of the small mud house, Baba Ao approached slowly, leaning on a staff he had carved himself when he chose to abandon his wealth. The old man breathed deeply, his eyes misty but steady. In each step he carried not just the weight of the years, but the memory of sleepless nights of knees. Bent on the ground begging God not to let his son die rich in possessions but poor in soul in the Yarda, and Josie spoke, in silence exchanging glances that said more than any word. Seeing the old man approach, I jumped to his feet, his heart beating like a drum under a full moon. Baba Ao stopped before him, his face stern on the outside but a sea of emotion raging within. With a slow gesture, he took from his pocket an old worn envelope. He handed it to Isina with a trembling hand. The son looked confused and opened it slowly. Inside was the deed to all the lands, the plantations, the rights to the farms that once sustained his empty luxury. Silence fell over the yard like a blanket. I don't give you this as an inheritance, said Baba Ao, his voice deep, deliberate. Each word is heavy as a millstone. I give it to you as trust. A man who kneels in the mud to ask for a woman deserves to build a true home. I waited a lifetime to see your knees touch the right ground. Tears ran freely down his face. He tried to speak, but no words came. The old man continued, his eyes fixed on his sons. These lands mean nothing if they are not used to plant character, if they don't shelter those in need, if they don't support those who work. I saw your rebirth, and no gold in the world can pay for what I saw. Ngoy stepped closer and held Ikena's hand. The young man looked at her, then at his father, and with a deep sigh, let the envelope fall to the ground. He bent down, carefully took the old man's hands. I don't want these lands to hide behind tall walls, he murmured. I want them to build a home, to open doors for those who have none. I want to use this land to build a workshop for her, for the women who wash, who sew, who create dreams in the silence of the night. The old man closed his eyes, a thick tear sliding slowly down his wrinkled skin. That was the harvest he had waited for all his life. Not corn, not cotton, the harvest of a true man. Behind them, neighbors began to gather one by one as if entering a church in silence. Each face showed respect, admiration, surprise. The factory foreman appeared, scratched his head, and bowed his eyes in reverence. And Jose's grandmother, sitting on an old bench, cried quietly, murmuring, "Thanks." There, on that simple ground, the whole village understood that wealth is not measured by the fences that divide, but by the embrace that unites. It's not the high roof that makes a house grand, but the firm ground built with sweat, truth, and faith. That night, Baba Iyo returned to the old house he once called a palace. But now the walls no longer carried the weight of pride. The silence was no longer of loneliness, but of peace. Upon entering, he looked at an old portrait of his wife, and in a low voice murmured he came back, not just home, but to himself. He sat on the wooden bench, the same one where he once knelt to pray. He leaned his head against the wall, his tearful eyes staring at the ceiling. His last thought danced in his mind like an ancient prayer. A man is measured by the ground he stands on, not by the roof he shows off. Outside, Ikana and Ngoy walked hand in hand. The simple ring shone faintly under the moonlight, but inside it held an entire universe of promises. The young man looked at the village, at the children running, at the elders murmuring blessings. For the first time, he felt his heart light, free. And in that instant, the village, the night, the stars, everything seemed to unite in a single silent hymn of hope. Because when a man understands the value of the ground, the sky becomes just, a detailed dot. Destiny may delay, but it never fails the just. And there under the African sky, a new chapter was born, woven with sweat, patched with humility, stitched with love. And so this story would spread from mouth to mouth, ride on the winds, live in hearts forever.